Welcome to the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. Today is Thursday, January 29th, 2026. I'm John Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary Magazine. With me, as always, executive editor Abe Greenwald. Hi, Abe.
Hi, John.
Social commentary columnist Christine Rosen. Hi, Christine.
Hi, John.
Senior editor Seth Mandel. Hi, Seth.
Hi, John.
And Washington Free Beacon editor Eliana Johnson. Hi, Eliana.
Hi, John.
We may be going to war with Iran in a matter of hours, days, or a week. Reports coming out last night that the Trump administration was readying a naval blockade of Iran's ports. Naval blockades, as Marco Rubio explained to the Senate the other day, a blockade is an act of war under sort of like the laws of war as they've been commonly understood. That's why he doesn't want to call what we're doing in Venezuela a blockade. He's calling it, what is he calling it? Like an embargo? I can't quote. There's another term, but he's like, I'm not saying blockade because that's an act of war. But this we're talking about with Iran, a blockade. And of course, there's also our carriers are getting into position. We have air forces moving into position. And the Israelis are being extensively consulted. Quick point. 2 days ago, or 3 days ago, he went on True Social, Trump, and said, hey, let's make a deal. And we're told that the administration has split into two camps, that he has advisors who want a diplomatic solution. They are Steve Witkoff and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner. And then there are people inside the administration who believe that we need to strike. And interestingly enough, they include J.D. Vance, but also Rubio and Pete Hegseth, if these stories are accurate. I have a theory that when Jared or Witkoff comes to him and says, I think there's a deal, the word deal like makes his sort of like, makes his eyes, it's like spinning his head and he's like so excited. It's the deal. I'm a deal maker. We could make a deal. Let's see if we can make a deal. And that has a kind of sugar high effect for a little bit. And then he puts terms of a deal on the table and the Iranians are like, we're not going to make a deal with you. And he's like, all right, fine. Now you've offended me double time. You're murdering your people. You're not listening to me. You're reconstituting your nuclear program, and you won't make a deal. So, all right. If we go, that's going to, I think, have played some kind of a role in the final decision to strike. I have no evidence of this except watching him for 35 years. And so that's what I'm going with. I'm sticking to it.
Well, I think there's a number of reasons that if we strike, I mean, God knows with him, who knows. But when you talk about deals, Trump seemed to have thought he had a deal with the mullahs, at least in the sense that they weren't going to slaughter Iranians in the streets. And they did. So that's a deal that was broken or made Trump look foolish. And I think that, is also a part of this equation here. I mean, more and more and more evidence and reporting has come out and eyewitness accounts of what went on in Iran after Trump had said, I think I took care of it.
Including reporting that Israel supplied intelligence to him. Not clear what that intelligence was, but that was characterized in reports as a smoking gun that Iran defied his orders to stop killing protesters after they claimed to him they would do so. I also think a major factor in what happened, and the president has spoken to this, was getting a force posture in the region that would reassure Israel and the president himself that if we act, we have forces in the region that would allow us to do so, to inflict maximum damage. And that is just happening right now. I think the USS Abraham Lincoln just in recent days arrived in the region. And maybe a week ago, it began moving from the South China Sea over into the Middle East. And so it actually made me wonder, how serious was the president when he said, "Oh, I agreed not to do anything because they said they'd stop killing the protesters." It did make me question that. And was he buying time to get forces in the region? Because I have long thought, and I thought since the beginning, that he was going to take action. I may yet be wrong, but I have thought that for the past couple of weeks.
Yeah, and dragging it out is also something that, it would be wild at this point if he didn't do something, because he's been talking about doing something for such a long time that it's very unlike Trump to literally do nothing after making, this kind of a scene over it. Like, at least do something just so you can say, we hit them, we punched them in the nose or something. And I think he's going to. But I also think that he is he talks about this deal, like he tells the Iranians, well, you can head off a strike if you give up your nuclear program and your ballistic missile program, and
stop killing protesters,
the terror proxies,
and stop killing protesters.
Yeah, there were 4 terms. Right.
This regime will never agree, because it would mean the end of the regime.
Right. And it's interesting because
no ballistic
it's also
missiles. Wait, Seth. So 4 terms: no ballistic missiles, no nuclear program, no funding of terror groups, and no killing of protesters. So 4 points. And then
it's unclear, actually. I mean, the New York Times, there's David Sanger piece in the New York Times that makes the point that the no killing of protesters appears to have gone off the table. So I'm actually not clear where that one stands, but wherever it stands, Iran is not going to agree to these terms.
Right. It's also where you would want to start in any negotiation, right? I mean, you start aiming high anyway, right? And the Obama and Biden strategy was to, well, what do you guys think that you could do? There was no, that's what shows you it wasn't a real negotiations. It was like, all right, this is unrealistic, and maybe that means there's no deal or whatever. But Trump is starting high by asking for everything. That's just kind of normal, because he's not attached to the idea of a deal. He's not waiting with bated breath for the Iranians to say yes. Obama went in and said, we need a deal. Any deal we get is going to be better than no deal. That was the line from the administration. And the supporters of the Iran deal said, many of them said reluctantly, look, it's not the deal I would have struck, but it's better than no deal, right? Better than no deal was a phrase that we heard a lot. Trump doesn't believe in better than no deal right now with Iran, because we have such the upper hand in this that it would be ridiculous to go begging. And so he starts high, and this is where any normal negotiation should have started. Stop sending Hezbollah to conquer areas in the region like you're some, like you're the Roman Empire. Stop building your nuclear weapons, and stop with the ballistic missiles that are getting us pulled into Ukraine and everything else, because you're resupplying the Russians while you're also threatening the Israelis. And now we got to come in and, battle back the ballistic missiles you shoot at the Israelis. And, we got to hear from Ukraine about how the war is never ending there because you're resupplying the Russians. Like, you're making us crazy, and you're putting our people in danger. Forget about our allies. And it should have been, from the very beginning, they shouldn't have these capabilities.
Remember that. Oh, sorry.
It happens to be the case that the conditions that we're starting out with are also necessary. I mean, this is anything short of Iran meeting those conditions is sort of no good to us. I mean, what makes them the threat they are at this point is the nuclear program, the very large buildup of ballistic missiles, and their terror proxies. I mean, that is exactly what we need from them. We would any halfway measures on any of that does us no good.
And
Remember
it's pretty
that
reasonable to ask a country not to do that.
Yep.
I mean, remember that in the Obama terms, when people rose up and said this deal is terrible, and remember 60% of the American people were opposed to the deal. 62 senators voted against the Iran deal. The way it was structured, because of a clever piece of legislative legerdemain, you needed 67 senators to vote against it for the deal to die. So like a reverse treaty, sort of an interesting, weird game that they played. But the deal was not popular. But their effort to push it across the finish line was to say it's either this or war. So that therefore, the only way to forestall war was this lousy deal. And Obama himself, in a major speech, said, "Is it everything that I would have wanted? No." Well, it's great. Oh, it's not everything you would have wanted. But in a negotiation, you don't get everything you always want. You get something, somebody else gets something. So Iran got $150 billion. It began violating the deal the minute that the money, the pallets of money showed up there. And so that's what it's like to make a deal with Iran. Like, we have history of making a deal with Iran, and that's why Trump pulled out of the Iranian nuclear deal in 2018 when he did and said the deal is dead. So it was weird that he was kind of initiating the idea of some kind of a new version of the deal, which I think raises the possibility that you're right, that it's disingenuous, that we weren't ready to go yet, and that he's been temporizing, saying, okay, let's talk about a deal, or we're not, but whatever, and or the Israelis asked us not to go yet, or whatever stuff we've been hearing over the last 2 weeks. What's interesting about this is that while, as Eliana says, David Sanger says that the massacre of the Iranian people is off the table as part of a potential deal, it will still be, it's still the casus belli here. We're not going after Iran because Iran did something untoward
Trump
to us.
Trump doesn't like killing and dead people. He has a major aversion to that. And it's part of what happened in Minnesota too.
Right. So my point here is it may be off the table, but we're only really going into Iran because the regime has been challenged from within since December 28th, I think, is when the major protests began erupting. They're on a scale that is new, was unprecedented, was in across the country, hundreds of thousands of people, and then led to this, carnage and slaughter, almost unprecedented in modern times, it appears, beginning on January 8th. And he's the president of the United States sitting there. And if we end up firing on the regime, we will do so because of what it's done internally. That's a pretty interesting change for him.
Although there were a couple of interesting things that Marco Rubio said in front of the Senate yesterday. One I noticed was that he talked about the internal economic conditions in Iran and how unstable the country was from within. He also noted that he thinks that the regime's attempts to quell these protests have worked, that they've actually squashed a lot of them. And at the same time, you have a bipartisan group of senators urging the administration to send money to build up the internet infrastructure that might allow Iranian protesters to get their message out, to get us these videos, to show us what's actually happening inside. So those things, as well as the fact that finally the Europeans are going to designate, hopefully, IRGC as a terrorist organization. I mean, there's a lot of shifting parts on the chessboard right now that I think speak to perhaps movement towards the regime being toppled. But it really struck me that Rubio was talking so much about the internal parts of the Iranian regime that are unstable right now, because before they were talking about the protesters. And I think the fact that maybe the protester point wasn't in the list of 4 points, as Eliana noted, and their vagueness on that right now, perhaps that is just buying time till they line up these other pieces. At least I hope so, for the sake of the Iranian people.
Yeah, well, the IRGC designation, thank you for mentioning that, because that's a really important indication John, of what you were saying about the casus belli, because that's the protests are what's getting Emmanuel Macron in France to finally drop his opposition to naming the IRGC as a foreign terrorist organization and proscribing them in Europe. I mean, that was France was standing up against the momentum every single time this came up in the EU, because this sort of designation has to be a unanimous vote. And so you won't even hold the vote as long as France says, well, we don't really like it. There's no purpose to holding the vote, and whatever, it dies immediately before it even gets off the ground. And this means it's going to go into a vote and they're going to talk about it. It may happen. It may not happen. It probably will happen with France's backing. But the point is that it wasn't even really seriously discussed before because everyone knew that France was opposed. There was no reason to really have a discussion. And so it just stayed on. And the other thing about the IRGC to remember is that the IRGC it's not the Iranian army, right? It was created as a check on the Iranian army. Probably first and foremost, among other things, but it was created in the wake of the revolution to make sure. It was like as if, Nixon got so suspicious of the CIA that he created a second CIA to make sure the CIA wasn't eavesdropping on him and didn't try to coup him. Like that's what this is. This is a fundamentally this is a creation of paranoia, of militaristic adventurism. It has no good purpose. It has no normal purpose because It is not what is sent out there to defend the borders of this country or even abroad. It is an exclusively ideological paramilitary tied to the people who are killing protesters in the streets. That's all it is. Right. And so discussing this is important because it highlights how abnormal Iran has become over the years since the revolution, and how accepted that has been. We don't have to go to Canada and say stop colonizing Lebanon and stop shooting rockets and stuff like that. Like, it's not a normal thing to have to negotiate with a country like Iran and to have an IRGC even to put on the prescribed terror list.
Okay, so I will say this about the fight against the IRGC, which we have been in, and of course, the head of the IRGC was assassinated in the first Trump administration, Qasem Soleimani, which was a very important moment in, arguably the high water moment in some ways of Trump's militaristic foreign policy in his first term. There's a question of the opportunity that has been provided to the West by what has happened in Iran over the past 6 weeks, by which I mean, ordinarily, we would not be adventuring, abroad in search of monsters to destroy. If the circumstances arise that the Iranian currency collapses and that millions of people go into the streets to say this regime should be ended and we're done, we can't take it anymore, and then the regime commits a series of unimaginable crimes against its own people, thus calling into question its legitimacy, or simply making the case that it will stay in power solely because of the terror that it can impose and fear that it can create in the hearts of its citizens. All of these things taken together, the West can look at and say, this time really is different. It isn't 2022 with the riots after the hijab murder, or it's not 2009, which was a protest about a stolen election, or 2017, which was a protest over rising food prices. This really does go to the heart of the regime, and therefore maybe all we need to do is give it a push, because if this regime is going to slaughter or injure 30 to 50,000 people in 48 hours, the uncertainty that is created by us toppling them, whatever is going to come after isn't going to be worse. Like, we always have to think, like, do you stick with the devil you know because the devil that would replace it would be worse? It's hard to make the case that anything could be worse than this regime based on what it did 2 weeks ago. Because nobody has been worse. No one has done worse. We don't have an example of turning your guns on your own people in the streets. We have examples of civil wars. We have examples of Syrian, horrors of the Assad regime, going after people with chemical weapons. But those are people who were living in areas that had been sort of taken over by in a civil war effort to topple the regime. It was a vicious and monstrous kind of warfare, but it was warfare. This is putting down a civilian revolt using guns and then going into hospitals and killing the people who had been injured who were in the hospitals, just to keep sending the message that there was literally nothing they would not do, which is apparently what Khamenei's order was, which is any means necessary. So you're Trump, you're Macron, you're the West, and you're looking at this and you're going, well, it's worth a shot, because if we, there are all these, the unintended consequence of getting a bad regime in place of this regime. That bad regime isn't going to be, I wish we were back in the days when we had the mullahs.
But the only thing
nobody could wish that.
Totally true. But for the non-interventionists, there is still the question of, well, we do have to manage whatever comes after. Even though it's not going to be, even though the odds of it being worse are vanishingly small, we're going to have to be involved in whatever goes on next. There's nuclear, there's fissile material floating around there. There's weapons, and there's energy. There's natural resources, and so whatever happens, it does mean a U.S. footprint of some sort. And there is that contingent in this administration that is, nothing is more horrifying to them.
It's fascinating if you think about it, because, of course, we're dealing with this question of what is going on in Venezuela after Maduro. And we're dealing with the question of Trump's hunger to annex or take control of Greenland. Trump is an imperialist of some sort. That is so counter to the non-interventionist credo, which is at the very least anti-imperialist in the sense that, we shouldn't be intervening in the world, because it causes us sorrows and horror back home. Even if you think that, American intervention always backfires and all that, that's a different kind of argument. But Trump is not only not an isolationist, he's sort of like sending out major signals that he's like the opposite of an isolationist in his own. They come to him and they say, we could like take Maduro and extract him and remove him and arrest him. Then we'll see what happens. It's like, sure, or we can like draw plans to take Greenland from Denmark. Now, we may look at that and say, that's Meshuggah. What the hell is he doing? Or not. There are more arguments for it than people realize. But talking about what's in his head, if you go to him and say, we could take out the regime in Iran, he's not Jimmy Carter. Like, he's not going to say, we can't do that. That's immoral. Or, we can't do, look how bad we do at everything. His line in his head is, everybody before me did badly. Bush did this badly. Obama did it badly. Reagan did. They all did it bad. I'm me. So, of course, when I do it, it's going to be fantastic. There's no problem with it theoretically or ideologically, because he doesn't look at the world theoretically or ideologically. It's more like, oh, there's a moment, they're coming to me with war plans. It looks like we can succeed. Then I can walk around and say, I took out this terrible regime and and now have taken the oil. So he's taken the oil in Venezuela. He's going to take the oil in Iran. Like that's great for him. So there's been a massive misunderstanding by MAGA that somehow their ideas preceded him. He took them in, breathed them in, and then was going to put them in practice, including non-interventionism. And this term is many things, and many of them are problematic, but non-interventionist it ain't. I know Rubio went before the Senate and said, we did not topple the regime. We took out an illegitimate president who was not ruling, who was not the elected president of Venezuela, had no standing to be president of Venezuela, and had been indicted under U.S. law. And Rand Paul said to him, you took out the president of another country. And Rubio said, he's not the president of Venezuela.
Sure, but Rubio also said, we'd love to see regime change in Cuba, and maybe we'll do it, and maybe we won't do it, and unclear. But it's not like he was some, so defensive about
not
regime
at all.
change. And the one thing Trump has been clear he is for is territorial expansion of the United States, which is not
imperialism,
non-intervention. Yes,
that is literally imperialism.
If you look back, I saw our former colleague Matt Continetti point out that Trump actually mentioned this in his second inaugural. He said the United States will once again consider itself a growing nation, one that increases our wealth, expands our territory, builds our cities. So he is making good on the promise that he made a year ago.
Right. But he's not a
obviously
fool.
Committed to it.
But he's not a fool. I mean, he's many things, but he's not a fool in this sense, which is, like I say, if in December we've already struck the Iranian regime, we took out the nuclear or buried the nuclear program, or did critical injury to the nuclear program in a massively successful, almost like world historic 37-hour intervention, putting the regime on the back foot, really causing it massive, I'm sure, internal problems, fears, all that, along with Israeli, covert actions and all of that. And then 6 months later, it's like, hey, we can get him out for good. And he's going to say, okay, show me the plan. If the plans are bad, then he probably wouldn't do it. If they say we don't, we estimate we have a 60% chance of success, he probably wouldn't do it. But if they come to him, and there are enough people in the administration who are not, rah, we should just do anything at any time, that there will be a voice at the table that says, then this is more risky than you realize. So I'm sure he's heard these voices. Maybe he heard them from Kushner.
The other
Wickoff.
thing that we're not talking about in this is he bombed the Houthis.
Yeah, that
was one of the first things he did.
Right.
And we saw, because of the signal leak, internal debate about that in the administration. We know for a fact there were voices at the table telling him not to do it. His vice president was telling him not to do it. Right. And he went ahead and did that. And it was clear because Stephen Miller in that chat said, we need to do this because it's what the president wants.
Right. So that's my point. So you come to him, the real question is, and maybe this is a good sign about A, the delay, and B, what is going to happen. I think he wants to be told that it's going to work, right? I mean, part of the difference between the Bush-Cheney view of what was needed after 9/11 and now is that Bush and Cheney understood that they were doing something risky. And the idea was that the need to take the risk outweighed the problems associated with the risk. And we are now dealing with the consequences of that. And I don't want to litigate the Iraq War.
In a much riskier time.
Right.
In a time of much heightened risk to the United States.
Right. But my point is that they were perfectly aware that this was not a walk in the park, or that the regime change was not going to be a walk in the park. They were maybe naive about how orderly the regime change could be, and they certainly didn't anticipate the nature of the civil war that would seriously erupt 2 years later after the removal of Saddam Hussein, but they were cognizant that they were taking a shot at something that had some prospect of failure. I think Trump doesn't want a prospect of failure. So you go to him and you say, we can go take Maduro out because we have the discombobulation machine. So
But
don't worry,
also,
we're going to land and turn on the discombobulation machine, and then everybody in Caracas is going to be like, what the hell is happening? And we'll just pull him out of the building and fly him out. And
I do feel like interventionists in this administration, if they want to make their case to Trump, should come with like a brand new cool super weapon each time they're asking the administration.
Well, maybe they are. That's my point. How do we know that's not happening?
There is a better example here, and folks at the Middle East Forum actually floated this, and I liked this idea, which is one of the ways to sell this both politically at home for the MAGA coalition, or for the sort of mishmash of conservatives and people on the right, is not the example of Iraq, which is the one that's always brought up by the isolationist right, and the left for that matter. It's the support that we gave the solidarity movement in Poland during the Cold War, the kind of thing where it was actually not a huge investment, no troops, but a lot of money and a strategy of diplomatic pressure, economic pressure, all kinds of different moving parts. But it was very clearly focused. Reagan's words about the solidarity movement, our support for the opposition, was absolutely on point throughout. And that kind of pressure, which allows an already collapsing regime to collapse further because it becomes isolated diplomatically, it becomes tenuous economically, and then you do have defense available, as we did during the Cold War, to move in if necessary. And I think that is a really interesting thing to suggest as a strategy. It also removes it from the more recent and obviously still very emotionally resonant example of Iraq, which in lots of ways is distinct from some of these other cases.
I think it's also worth pointing out that the more successes, and I mean, if we go into Iran and topple the regime, that will mean that in the first year, essentially, of the Trump administration, Israel and America will have won the war in Gaza, will have taken out the Iranian nuclear program, will have toppled the regime in Iran, and will have extracted Maduro from Venezuela. So, with those in your back pocket, when Podunkia starts acting up and you go, hard power turns into soft power. All the president needs to say is, I don't like what you're doing. And I've got the discombobulation machine. This is the greatest thing ever. It's like out of Get Smart. It's the discombobulation machine.
I just keep picturing Count Rugen putting the discombobulator up to 50 on Wesley.
Oh man, that is a very excellent analogy. Anyway, better than Get Smart. So I'm just saying that, when you act, you make it unnecessary to act later because you scare the stuffing. I wasn't going to say stuffing, but I recognize our ecumenical audience here, out of some 2-bit podunk player on the planet who is going to do something that we don't like. And that's a huge benefit for American foreign policy. They're just, and something that any American president would be grateful to have in his back pocket. Obama would have been happy to have that in his back pocket. I mean, he tried to use it with our allies instead of with our enemies. That was he wanted to threaten Israel, not Iran. You figure that out someday for yourself,
John,
if you want to.
When you talk about Trump wanting to act when someone comes to him and says, "Okay, we've brought the risk down to zero," I think this goes a long way in explaining his inability to do anything regarding Russia, Ukraine. Because
they can't get the number down.
They can't. Yeah, exactly right.
There's we can't manage the number. Like it's the variables are too immensely complicated, right?
So like all we could do is chase Putin.
Yeah, or we could give the Ukrainians $100 billion and they could still not end up getting back the Donbass or or Crimea or whatever. Like that's right. So it seems like a fool's errand to try to go that way for him. I think it's wrong. I think their calculations are wrong, and are probably someone's putting their finger on the scale to make sure that he feels this way. By the way, anybody notice that while this is going, a massive Iranian thing is building up, is going on, where our director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, who is the coordinator of the, I don't know, what is this, 7 different intelligence agencies within the federal government, where she was yesterday? Was she in the situation room while the ships were heading to the offshore of Iran? Was she I don't know where, was she at CENTCOM? Was she anywhere?
I feel like we haven't heard from her.
Where she was? She was in Fulton County, Georgia.
She's relitigating the 2020 election.
Right.
She's the director of national intelligence. She was in Fulton County, Georgia, as a warrant was executed to take possession of the right of the ballots, of the physical ballots that are the obsessional focus of Stop the Steal people, while we are about to maybe go to war in Iran. She's like, riding the elevator at the Hyatt in Atlanta up and down on the outside of the building, and getting
she's
some
doing
good
Trump's
barbecue.
bidding, though. I mean, this is actually something that I imagine she agreed. It's not that she can agree or disagree. I'm sure she was enthusiastically dispatched because she's trying to get back into the good graces of this administration. She has been sidelined over and over again since her appointment to that role. And this is the dark side of Trump. This is his absolute obsession with proving that he legitimately won the 2020 election. And I think it's certainly not going to resonate with American voters right now who put elections behind them and move forward. He looks embittered, and he looks vindictive, and he looks like he's wasting resources on something that isn't a national problem.
Okay, but let's talk about flipping the switch on the script. Can you flip a switch on the script?
I'm very confused by this.
I'm sorry, flipping the script and flipping the switch.
Yeah, just flip.
Okay, just consider the last 24 to 48 hours in Minneapolis after the Pretti killing. Bovino is out. Noam sidelined. Homan in. Phone calls with Waltz and Fry. Homan negotiating with Waltz and Fry, and Trump negotiating with Schumer to make sure that they can get the government not to shut down if the Democrats are so insistent on revisiting Department of Homeland Security funding, excising Department of Homeland Security funding from the bill that needs to pass by January 31st in order for the government to keep running. Suddenly, he's acting like a conventional president. That is to say, okay, we'll negotiate, we'll do this, we'll have a deal. I'm working with the Senate Majority Leader. My Border Patrol guy is making proper arrangements with the authorities in Minneapolis and Minnesota. He's like, okay, I don't think this worked. We're going another way. And I think the one thing about him is when he does do one of these flips, it'll be next week like what happened in the month of January never happened. It'll be like, I didn't know it was I don't know. I didn't really know that Christy Noam. Never really, I heard she's a nice lady. Don't really know her as she goes back to whatever Dakota she came from, which I expect will happen pretty soon. Have you heard this scenario where Noam goes, he nominates DeSantis resigns from the governorship in Florida because he's term limited anyway, and appoints his whoever it is person as a sort of placeholder for Donald, and then wherever it is going to be governor, and then DeSantis reestablishes himself as a national figure, and then we have the Vance DeSantis Rubio bake off for 28.
Well, I thought you were going to say that was to get Rubio out of the bake-off by offering him Florida.
I'm gonna
Okay.
DeSantis
Okay.
leaves,
Right.
and
I'm
then
gonna put that in the very unlikely
Okay.
category. Can I rant about another script flip that was not a script flip?
Sure.
In my view,
Sure.
we had all sorts of people and now lots of national news articles covering the new video of Alex Pretti that came out, that he's the protester who was shot and killed by Border Patrol agents over the weekend. And the video shows him getting in the face of Border Patrol agents and kicking the tail light of a federal vehicle. And the articles say, this shows what kind of a new light, that he wasn't merely a peaceful protester, but he was getting in the face of agents. And I just don't think that's right. I think the original video made that clear as well. This new video really showed me nothing new. And I know I wasn't on the podcast the day after, on Monday.
On Monday,
the
right.
day you guys talked about this, but I really don't see why this video should change our analysis of the whole situation at all. Though it does underscore that the idea that really any of this is peaceful protest is total garbage. That and shows, he show his behavior, but you can see it in the original video, getting up in the faces of these agents. That this really is an attempt at woke nullification, and that his goal and their goal was to interfere with and prevent the enforcement of federal law and to harass federal law enforcement agents. That doesn't mean that what happened to him is right at all. I don't think it is right. And that while local police don't have to enforce immigration laws, they do have to prevent the harassment of federal immigration officials, and they have to prevent local residents from preventing immigration officials from doing their job, and they haven't been doing that. And I think you can see that in both videos. And it drove me crazy to hear people saying, oh, well, this video shows us something new. I don't think it shows us anything new. We can see that in every video we've seen out of Minnesota this entire time. The goal of these people is to interfere with federal law enforcement and to prevent them from doing their jobs.
Right. So
it's been a green light on that, because the thing that catches you about the video is that he's chasing them. Alex Pretti is chasing ICE officers. They get in their car to drive away, and he chases them.
And
right? This is the atmosphere, and he spits on them, and then, by the way, he vandalizes the car. He kicks the taillight off.
Right, but he spits, kicks the taillight, and before he does either of those things, he says, "Attack me, mother F."
Right.
Which, again, none of this justifies the actions that were taken against him in the last 6 seconds of his life. But they crystallize the purpose of the demonstrations. Right. Attack me is what the protesters want. And they are seeking to create confrontations to delegitimize and discredit federal law enforcement officers who have been given a task by their commanders in Washington. They're not Kyle Rittenhouse. They didn't drive there on their own to cosplay being, a person helping during a riot. They are creating a riot for the purpose of pushing ICE and Border Patrol agents too far to create incidents that will delegitimize them. And Pretti, what's interesting or new about this is that, where I disagree with you, is that this now provides a kind of piece of almost novelistic evidence that Pretti wanted something to happen And the tragedy is that it happened to him, but not to somebody else.
Well, the tragedy is actually that something didn't happen to him in that first altercation, which is that local law enforcement should have detained him at the very least, cited him for assault or some misdemeanor.
That's
which
my
would have done
point.
one of
And
two things. It
seized
would have
his
either
gun
kept
and
him off the
taken,
streets,
and then he,
or it would have
and
He
then
had
perhaps
his gun
encouraged him.
holstered in his waistband.
and then he
There were
Their
a
job.
million things that they could have done that might have made him pause before he went back a second time.
That's a really important point.
Their job was to prevent him from harassing and interfering with federal law enforcement agents who were trying to enforce federal law. He could not do that. I don't think his behavior had any bearing on the second altercation.
Right.
But it does speak to the absence of local law enforcement who were not doing their jobs, and to the nature and the purpose of all of these protesters and these stupid people with their whistles and their phones. And by the way, to what the intent of the words and the rhetoric of Minnesota officials have been, who are ginning people up to do these things. Because when you tell citizens that ICE and Border Patrol are the Gestapo and that they're going after Anne Frank and they're trying to round up Anne Frank, the natural reaction, like if that were true, people should be out with their whistles and whatever. But by the way, the fact that Alex Pretti is kicking the taillight and people are out with their whistles shows that they're not the Gestapo.
Right.
Right, and that's the really important point that Eliana, part of what's so important about what Eliana is saying is that, we remember the image of the one ICE guy standing outside a hotel, and
yes, with blood running out of his nose.
With blood running out of his one guy, right, because local law enforcement were not being allowed to go protect this is a local building, a local institution, right? I mean, all of this stuff falls under local policing, but it's also that they've put ICE in the situation of being like, all right, you're the one guy with his back against the wall, smashed glass behind you and blood running down your face, and there's a crowd coming toward you. We could put local police to have a barrier, between the horde running at you and, one guy with a gun who hasn't slept in 36 hours and his blood running down his face. But there are, it doesn't excuse if the ICE officer in that situation does something he's not trained to do. But that's the point. Why hasn't there been a barrier, something between, if they're really protesters, then put a line of cops between them and ICE and let them say whatever they want to say. And let them hold whatever signs they want to say, just like we've seen in every other situation. In New York, where there's massive protests, there are police. And the police form a barrier, and they stop protesters and counter-protesters from brawling.
Well,
and they
see
stop
what happens.
protesters
We'll see
and
what
cops
happens
from
in
brawling.
New York. We'll see what happens in New York under the new mayor. I mean,
one thing
that's true, but the purpose is there's just an easy solution here. That it's like, no, they're not. The cops would be accused of being there to protect ICE.
Yeah.
But no, what you're seeing is that they're there to make sure that people like Alex Pretti also don't get hurt or, God forbid, killed in these situations.
There's a second thing that needs to happen besides local law enforcement. It does speak to Eliana's point about the rhetoric. We've spent a lot of time also criticizing some of the rhetoric coming out of the Trump administration, which I think is fair to do. It has not helped in these situations, particularly Kristi Noem. But what's important to remember is that this is how mainstreamed this moral grandstanding has become, particularly among officials on the left. And if you turn everything into a moral case, if you say this is like the Holocaust and this is like Anne Frank, that moral grandstanding brings people a lot of positive attention from their own side of the aisle. And it's difficult for these politicians not to speak in those terms anymore because they're so readily awarded for it, first on social media, obviously, but by their own constituents. But it is a very dangerous language to use for people who want to come out and peacefully protest, because you're forcing them to see this as a good versus evil rather than I don't like this policy, I would rather have this policy, which is much a cooler minded way of looking at some of these things. So everything is moral grandstanding these days. I mean, it's and I think Waltz and Fry in particular have given us an example of that. It's why we like Homan, who the other day I think I called Homans over and over because I hadn't had enough coffee. But Homan and his demeanor
there was a Charles.
Yes,
Homan.
I mean, Homan is actually what you should do if you're an official on either side of this issue, which is talk about it as an issue, as a policy, as implementation, not using the language of moral grandstanding.
I mean, some things are being said that are even after 10 years of Trump, or 25 years since 9/11, and the rhetoric of the left going haywire about how George Bush lied us into Iraq, or like 9/11 was an inside job, whatever stuff you have, that the admittedly radical DA of Philadelphia would literally say, we are going after you. If you work for ICE, we're going after you. That Stephen Colbert would say what you will about the Gestapo, they didn't wear masks. I think Abe pointed out that, I didn't hear any complaining about people wearing masks during the encampment period.
Yeah.
Was that okay that they were wearing masks in order to evade scrutiny by law enforcement, the Hamas supporters? And all of that stuff, and all of that contributes to this unrealistic cosplay atmosphere. And I think what's important about the January 11th, that's the one Pretti, 10 days before his actual killing. Pretti says, attack me, right? He spits on somebody. He kicks out the taillight of a car. Each one of those, forget the attack me thing. The spitting and the kicking out of the taillight are misdemeanor crimes at the very least. Plus the fact that he was in the street, which, by the way, is a misdemeanor crime. You are not allowed as a human being to stand in the middle of a street unless you're crossing a street in a crosswalk. Like that's reckless endangerment or whatever it is. You're not allowed to do that. They had 3 different things on which he could have been arrested and detained. And 2 things would have had, one of which is, it could have been like, okay, this is a serious business. You're gonna play. We're gonna then think twice about whether or not you want to go back out into the street if you're going to kick out a taillight of a car and do property damage to an official vehicle or a private vehicle or anybody's vehicle. You don't kick somebody's taillight out with your foot.
Well, you have a gun on you.
And then that's the second point.
Extra insanity. If you have a gun on you, you should be extra careful in baiting and taunting.
Yeah. And by the way,
they teach you that in concealed carry class. They literally teach that lesson over and over again.
Also, just point out the
he had a gun. It's important to point out.
Stupidity.
You need to explain that he had a gun, the same gun he had in
his waistband.
He had in his waistband 10 days earlier when he kicked out the taillight.
Can I also just point out the asymmetry and stupidity of this mask point by Colbert? The Hamasniks on campuses were wearing masks to prevent accountability for defying rules, regulations, and sometimes laws. And ICE is wearing masks to prevent themselves from being harassed for enforcing the law.
Right, to being doxxed, to having your identities, and then people going to their house.
It's not even the same.
Yeah, right. But I think the important point is, if he were arrested for kicking out the taillight, I believe they would take his gun away. In other words, they would say, you've been arrested as you were pursuing this crime. Though you are licensed, you committed a misdemeanor crime. I would need to look up Minnesota state law, but I believe the surrender of the firearm, he would have to go back to court to get his firearm to reestablish that the concealed carry permit that he has likely says, if you commit a misdemeanor offense, your permit will be taken away from you.
This is also a broken windows theory, type situation where allowing the smaller level chaos and disorder, which was allowed in this case, leads to larger level crime, chaos, and disorder. If this had been stamped out, we wouldn't have had the tragedy that occurred on Saturday.
Exactly, but I mean,
They're
practically speaking, if he had gone through this, and he would have been arraigned and then released, it's a misdemeanor offense. He would have been held in jail for a week or something like that.
He would have
But
been put on notice.
He
This
would have
is
been
not
put on
okay.
notice, and I think they would have taken his gun away, I believe, or they would have, at least taken it in until, there was a procedure, and then he wouldn't have had a gun on him 12 days later that got him killed.
There's also a moment here now, and this is the political moment that we were talking about earlier, where Trump is negotiating with Schumer and Senate Democrats, who do have political leverage now because of the public opinion shift against some of the tactics that the administration is using. And it does speak directly to issues like the masking. So if you oppose ICE wearing masks, that's now on the table to negotiate in terms of what federal law enforcement should or shouldn't be allowed to do as a matter of procedure, just like should they wear body cams? Are there should federal officials be allowed to issue quota requirements for the officers who are enforcing law? All of these things are now things that can and should be negotiated, which is how our system's supposed to work. There are Republicans who support some of these reforms and would be happy to see them changed as well in whatever comes out of these negotiations. But that's where you have those battles. You don't listen to late night comedians and, crazies on social media and take it to the streets and try to fight, ICE yourself. All of those are extra political, often violent, certainly harmful ways that also don't lead to long-term reform. If you really want to reform ICE, you pay very close attention to who your elected official is backing in these coming negotiations, and you vote them out if you don't like it. I mean, it's slow. It's not it doesn't allow you to morally grandstand. It doesn't allow you the thrill of doing something transgressive, but it is how our system is meant to work.
You're supposed to pay attention. Yeah,
I've been thinking about Eliana's first point about the newly released video of the earlier Pretti footage, and I think it makes a difference in this sense. It makes it clear that he was there and was showing up to be attacked. He was there to draw officers to him. He wanted to create some kind of situation in which he could claim victimization by them. And he's not the only one. There's a lot of that going on out there. And as long as that dynamic keeps happening, there's going to be more cases. Because if you go there and it was like he did everything he could to get them to attack him. Kicking, spitting, having a gun, saying, "Attack me." It shows how easy it is for these agents mistakenly to end up killing someone.
I mean, you're asked to understand human nature, right? I mean, it's like, well, this is allowed and this is legal and but also like you're supposed to understand how people would react in a situation in which, these things happen, right? You're supposed to understand human nature. I mean, that's part of, like, as Christine says, when you're going through the licensing process for a carry permit, it's like 80% of the training is just them finding other ways to say, don't be a cowboy. That's the majority of I mean, there's other stuff, important stuff too, but it's like that is drilled into your head to the point where you leave the class not really sure you want to carry anymore. It's like they're trying to
responsibility of having that weapon.
Yes,
is
people
definitely
who carry every day as your instructors sound like they're trying to talk you out of it, even while they're talking up the benefits and the rights to do so, precisely because of the immense amount of responsibility and because they are saying, like, you're going to join this tribe, right, of concealed carriers. Don't give us a black eye. Don't be the bad apple that makes everybody hate me. I've carried responsibly for 35 years. Don't get in there with a hothead and do something that costs everybody their rights and stuff like that. But it's also about understanding how people perceive the presence of a gun, right? The instructors tell you over and over again that when you are in a situation, if something arises, somebody harasses you on the street, whatever it is, you need to sort of go above and beyond to establish your lack of desire for a fight if you have a gun on you. Because especially law enforcement, if and when they arrive, will see the gun fairly or unfairly. I mean, again, it's usually unfairly, but people will see the gun as this guy wanted a fight or something, something like that. They see that, and so the pressure is on you to be able to say, the instructor will say, well, you should be loud when you tell somebody to get away from you, so that bystanders see that you tried talking to the person first. Don't do it quietly, and don't be like, I have a gun. Yeah. Or, put your hand on your hip or something like that. You want everybody to see you basically begging for no confrontation and trying desperately to get out of a confrontation, because you will be assumed to have wanted a confrontation if you were carrying a weapon later, and you need to somehow offset that.
There was, I was thinking about how this notion of, remember the notion of John Lewis, I think it made the phrase well known, of good trouble during the civil rights movement. And he contrasted, his mother was always saying, stay out of trouble, which she meant don't go pick a fight, don't go out in the world looking for trouble. And the civil rights movement had this sense of civil disobedience, peaceful protest. You don't actually go and attack law enforcement. That's not the kind of trouble. They talked about good trouble in that way. And there's been this real perversion for these movements, these activist movements, that I think really, Eliana's right. They see themselves as going out on a morally just cause. They are fighting this good fight. And that means they should attack federal law enforcement, because federal law enforcement, they've been told, are fascist. So there's a real perversion of our understanding of what true civil disobedience looks like according to the rights that we have in our Constitution. And again, this is a leadership problem. Those need to be repeated over and over again so people understand what their rights and responsibilities are when they oppose a policy of their local, state, federal governments.
I just want to read my favorite paragraph of the morning before Eliana does her recommendation. We mentioned him earlier in the week. It's Mike Solana, the editor-in-chief of Pirate Wires, and here is what he wrote in an item called Frau Swisher's Mad Tribunal. From celebrities sobbing over ice at their luxurious Sundance parties to a very small, very vocal minority of commie tech employees demanding political statements from their CEOs while dollar store journalists cover the various bad things they say on Twitter, America's starting to feel like 2020 again, and nothing so perfectly demonstrated our flashback to cultural authoritarianism as former tech journalist Kara Swisher and her pet eunuch Scott Galloway's demand for explicitly Nuremberg trials targeting their political enemies this week on the anti-tech industry podcast Pivot. So, do these sideshow freaks really believe deporting illegals is equivalent to Hitler's dictatorship, which concluded in 80 million dead? I sort of don't think so, as the first rule of surviving an actual dictator is not, publicly threatening to kill him. But they do keep saying people who disagree with them belong in prison, and I'm starting to believe they really mean that part. Eliana, you have a recommendation.
I have a recommendation. I want to credit Hugh Hewitt, who in my interview with him last week or the week before brought this book back to mind. I am rereading it. Hugh Hewitt asked me about one of my college professors, and I ended up recommending this book on his show. I had a legendary college professor by the name of Charles Hill, went by Charlie Hill. And Hugh brought back to mind a biography of him that was written by one of his students, one of my classmates, Molly Worthen. It's called The Man on Whom Nothing Was Lost by Molly Worthen. And he was legendary among a subsection of Yale students, including me and others. And Molly chronicles his career as a Foreign Service officer through Europe, to Hong Kong, Israel, as an aide and speechwriter to Henry Kissinger, and ultimately as executive aide to George Shultz in the Reagan administration. He went on to help Shultz write his memoirs, also served at the UN with Boutros Ghali. And it is a wonderful memoir of a wonderful biography of a career in the Foreign Service, but also of a student figuring out, learning that her hero is a real person with flaws. And I highly recommend the book. It's a wonderful read.
He also, Charles Hill, like he wrote this great book sort of late in his career about how classic literature factors into understanding grand strategy. And aside from it being a good book and an interesting book, nobody wrote books like that. Like before, like it is in the world of these academics, it is highly unusual to have such a creative, idea of an academic book and land it perfectly.
Well, he wasn't an academic, which was an important part of what made him great. He was a proud generalist. And Seth, that brings to mind, when I was in college, there was a debate about what's the most important humanity. Was it history, philosophy, or literature? And he debated literature and was always a champion of reading great works of literature. And then, yes, he wrote a book. This book, I can't remember the title now, but talking about
grand strategies,
grand strategies about the grand strategic thinking evident in great works of literature that is wonderful.
I say we have both because I can't choose between history and literature. I want all of it.
He, I think, without question, was in a world in which we talk about, the deep state and everything like that. He was the most revered person of his generation in the U.S. Foreign Service and a diplomat of extraordinary cultural, political depth. Everyone who worked with him found him astoundingly impressive. And when I took over the editorship of Commentary in 2009, I got in touch with him because I asked him to review a book or something like that. And he wrote me back and he said, I'm finishing a book of my own, but I really have to tell you, writing is such an agony for me. It's an agony because I just, I always fall short of what it is that I want to produce. And I therefore, I would love to say yes to you, but it's just too taxing, emotionally taxing for me to write on assignment. And even there, this little note, and I'd only met him once or something like that, but the kind of depth of this response, which I totally understood, and I had heard to be the case, that some people said, if he could have written under his own name or comfortably written under his own name, he would have been a major American figure in American intellectual life. But it was just, there are people who can manage to produce reams of writing, and as long as their own names are not on it, it's a famous kind of neurotic deformity of a certain type of intellectual, and he was such a person. So when he actually did finally write his own book, it was like a remarkable creation, but it took him, 20 years actually, or something like that, even to get it done. So The Man on Whom Nothing Was Lost.
Yeah, and this book gives a sense of the impact that he had after a career in the Foreign Service on countless numbers of students. And I will say personally, for all of his understanding of every great work of literature and philosophy and history, the personal advice dispensed and the willingness to wade into students' personal lives by both him and a couple of others there was the most important of all.
Wonderful recommendation. We'll be back tomorrow for Abe, Eliana, Seth, and Christine. I'm John Podhoretz. Keep the candle burning.